A world divided, the dawn of the Cold War. The Cold War was a period of intense rivalry and tension. It gripped the world from the end of World War II until the early 1990s. Instead of direct military confrontations, the conflict was marked by espionage, political maneuvering, and proxy wars. Two superpowers dominated this era, the democratic capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. These ideological opposites, once allies against Nazi Germany, became locked in a global struggle for dominance. The Cold War was not a traditional war with battlefields and treaties. It was a war of ideas, a clash between two fundamentally different ways of life. The US sought to contain the spread of communism, promoting democracy and free markets. The USSR, meanwhile, aimed to expand its sphere of influence and export its communist ideology. This ideological battle played out on a global stage, shaping the destinies of nations and impacting the lives of millions. The Cold War was a time of great uncertainty and fear. The threat of nuclear annihilation loomed large, casting a long shadow over the world. Yet it was also a time of technological innovation and societal change. The space race, for instance, spurred advancements in science and technology. The struggle for civil rights in the US and the dissident movements within the Soviet bloc challenged the existing order, ultimately contributing to the fall of communism. Seeds of conflict, from Yalta to the Iron Curtain. The seeds of the Cold War were sown even before World War II ended. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, Allied leaders met to discuss the post-war order. The US, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union agreed to divide Germany into zones of occupation. However, differences over the future of Eastern Europe emerged. Stalin, determined to create a buffer zone between the USSR and the West, began installing communist regimes in the countries liberated from Nazi control. In 1946, Winston Churchill, in his famous Iron Curtain speech, declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. This metaphor vividly captured the growing division between East and West. The Soviet Union's actions in Eastern Europe, coupled with its increasingly assertive foreign policy, fueled Western fears of communist expansion. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 marked the formalization of US Cold War policy. This doctrine pledged American support for countries threatened by communist expansion. It was followed by the Marshall Plan, a massive economic aid program designed to rebuild war-torn Europe and prevent the spread of communism. These initiatives signaled the beginning of the US's policy of containment, a strategy aimed at halting the expansion of Soviet influence. The Cold War was not simply a conflict between two superpowers, it was a global struggle that reshaped the world. It led to the formation of military alliances, NATO in the West, and the Warsaw Pact in the East, dividing Europe into two armed camps. The Cold War also fueled numerous proxy wars, as both superpowers sought to advance their interests and undermine their rivals in regions far from their own borders. Flashpoints, proxy wars and crises averted. The Cold War was characterized by a series of crises and proxy wars that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. One of the first major confrontations was the Berlin Blockade of 1948 to 1949. The Soviet Union blocked all land and water access to West Berlin, hoping to force the Western powers out of the city. The US and its allies responded with the Berlin Airlift, supplying West Berlin by air for almost a year. The blockade was eventually lifted, but the event highlighted the deep divisions and mistrust between East and West. The Korean War, from 1950 to 1953, was another major flashpoint. Communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded US-supported South Korea. The US intervened militarily, leading to a bloody three-year conflict that ended in a stalemate. The Korean War demonstrated the willingness of both superpowers to engage in proxy wars to prevent the expansion of the other's influence. Perhaps the most dangerous moment of the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from US shores. This move sparked a 13-day standoff between the US and the USSR, with the world holding its breath as the two superpowers teetered on the brink of nuclear war. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev eventually reached an agreement. The Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, and the US secretly agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey. The Vietnam War, spanning from 1954 to 1975, was another protracted and costly conflict that exemplified the global reach of the Cold War. The US intervened to support South Vietnam against the communist North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong allies. The war became increasingly unpopular in the US, and the US eventually withdrew in 1973. The fall of Saigon to North Vietnamese forces in 1975 marked a significant defeat for the US and its allies.